All right. So as I was just saying, tonight is going to be very, very exciting and really brilliant. And I'm very happy to be doing Giovanni Bellini for the first time at Drawing from History. We've looked at lots of artists from lots of different schools of painting, and we've just finished a fantastic series on Andrea Mantegna. And I don't think it would have been in any way even remotely appropriate to have focused on any other artist in this series apart from, other than Giovanni Bellini in this series, because Bellini is so closely related artistically, geographically, and even in terms of the family dynamic to Mantegna. So we're sort of following on very nicely from one great Northern Italian artist who was a leading proponent of the Paduan School to now looking at possibly the most central figure in the foundation of the distinctively Venetian school of painting in the Renaissance, and that is Giovanni Bellini. He is one of the most important painters of the entire Italian Renaissance. He is most certainly one of the key and central figures in the development of the Venetian school and one of the key figures in the Venetian school in its entirety. He's one of the most pioneering and innovative and inventive artists of the Renaissance for many reasons. He's a real pioneer of portraiture, really of landscape. He does far more with landscape than any painter had done prior to him that we know of throughout the Middle Ages into the early Renaissance. We can't say that conclusively with regard to painters of antiquity, because there were lots of painters of antiquity who painted exquisite landscapes. But we're going to have a little introduction of Bellini now, and then we're going to get into a really fun workshop. So straight away, I've mentioned another artist already, haven't I? And that artist was Andrea Mantegna. Oh no, that's Giovanni Bellini, and that is Andrea Mantegna here. So this is Bellini. That's the artist who we're focusing on today. And there is Bellini just there poking his head in on the side there. And I'm going to begin my introduction, and we're going to have a really, really fun workshop. So enjoy, everybody. So as I've mentioned, he is one of the great Northern Italian painters of the Renaissance and a central figure in the Venetian school. And here is his self-portrait right in the middle of the screen. We've got a beautiful self-portrait by Bellini, which he painted sometime around the turn of the century in around 1500. It's oil on canvas, and it's in the Capitolini museums in Rome, the Musei Capitolini, one of those amazing sites that we have in Rome. Lots of sculpture in there, lots of amazing artifacts, as well as beautiful paintings. So this is a self-portrait by him. And then on the right, we have his brother-in-law, Andrea Mantegna. He was influenced heavily by Mantegna. And he was also influenced heavily by a whole host of artists, including Pisanello, who was a great Tuscan artist born in Pisa, as his name suggests, and but who traveled quite widely. And Pisanello was actually associated with Giovanni Bellini's father, Jacopo Bellini, because both of those artists, both Bellini's father, Jacopo, and Pisanello were both trained by Gentile da Fabriano, one of the really, really important artists at the dawn of Renaissance painting. Okay, he's also really influenced by Jacopo Bellini, his father, because Bellini was a great painter himself and a great draftsman. And as we can see here, if I move to this slide, we've got a beautiful drawing by Giovanni Bellini's father, Jacopo. And that beautiful drawing is in the British Museum. It's on paper, and it depicts some lions. And we can just imagine what sort of exotic animals were being brought into Venice during the early 15th century, because Venice was a route into the East. Lots of things from the East came into Venice, came into the West through Venice, via Venice, but also lots of ideas and lots of artistic ideas went eastwards from Venice as well, because Venice was a great location of exchange, cultural and artistic and intellectual exchange via Byzantium, and then after the fall of Byzantium in 1453 with the Ottoman Empire. So they've got a beautiful drawing by Bellini's father, Jacopo Bellini, stunning drawing in mixed media, metal point and ink on paper there. All right, very reflective of the sorts of attention to detail and attention to naturalistic detail, and also natural organic forms that are also dynamic. So it's a really amazing example of the sort of draftsmanship that the young Giovanni Bellini was exposed to while growing up. He was also very heavily influenced by Donatello, as everybody was, and I really emphasized that in the previous series with our focus on Mantegna. Donatello didn't only influence sculptors, he really profoundly impacted painting and the graphic arts, drawing and the work on paper. Drawing after Donatello really emphasizes form and movement and tone to enhance form and a sense of form, and relief. The emphasis is on relief, essentially, because relief, or relievo in Italian, is to in drawing is to give a sense of sculptural form radiating off of the page, or sort of moving off of the page in volume. So lots of influence there. And he also had a brother who was an artist. There we go. There is Gentile Bellini. I'm just going to enable you to see that more better there. That wonderful drawing is a self-portrait by Giovanni Bellini's brother Gentile. And Gentile was a very different kind of artist to Giovanni. Giovanni Bellini really doesn't do much, if anything, outside of Venice, whereas his brother Gentile was a great traveler who traveled eastwards to Constantinople and drew the Sultan Mehmed II, and he was a very, very different kind of artist with a very different artistic temperament. Not only was Giovanni Bellini hugely influenced by these artists as well as others, he would himself exert tremendous influence on artists across Italy and the rest of Europe, including Leonardo da Vinci, Giorgione, and Titian. In the opening decades of the 16th century, Giorgione and Titian built on and developed Bellini's inventive innovations in painting, and Bellini even responded to them. So you've got Titian and Giorgione who were taught by Giovanni Bellini, and when they start to do things differently, when they start to push the limits of painting further and beyond what Bellini had established in his remarkable career, he started to respond to what they were doing, and he was even influenced by his own pupils. And so that's really why I've named this series the Nexus of Innovation, because that's what Giovanni Bellini really is. There is him in his later years, after 1500, entering into a sort of reciprocity and artistic exchange with his students. And that is in conjunction with the amount of influence that he absorbs from previous artists and his contemporaries, such as his father, Andrea Mantegna, Donatello, Gentile Bellini, and Antonello da Messina as well, a great artist from southern Italy who brought a lot of northern influence into Italian painting in the 15th century. So who was Giovanni Bellini? Well, he was a Venetian painter. He was born in Venice around the year 1430. He was raised in the household of Jacopo Bellini, his father, and he lived with his brother, Gentile. They shared a workshop. They often completed commissions together. That self-portrait by his brother Gentile is in Berlin, and that's a beautiful self-portrait from around 1496. They were a really formidable and pioneering household in Jacopo Bellini's workshop, and they had an outstanding and substantial output as a group of artists. And records state that they even completed altarpieces together, and all three of them placed their signatures on altarpieces. So there were artworks which the three Bellinis, Gentile, Jacopo, and Giovanni, worked on together. So as I mentioned, Giovanni Bellini was trained by his father, Jacopo, and we've got a drawing by Jacopo here on the upper left, and here on the bottom left is a painting. It's the Adoration of the Magi by Gentile da Fabriano, who was born around 1370. So in the decades leading up to the Quattrocento, that's when Gentile da Fabriano was born. He was also the teacher, as I mentioned earlier, of Pisanello, who another great, fantastic artist who we'll definitely do a workshop on at some point. So Gentile was from a town near Fabriano, but he didn't stay in Fabriano or around Fabriano. He traveled north, and he also spent a lot of time in Tuscany. And when Jacopo Bellini was being trained by Gentile da Fabriano, that took place in Florence. And so what does that mean? Well, not only is Jacopo Bellini being trained by Gentile da Fabriano, this great Gothic painter, international Gothic painter, he's also active in Florence. And so Giovanni Bellini, who's trained by his father, has his training enriched by exposure to the Florentine tradition as well. So there's a tremendous amount of influence going on at this point, and it's funneling in to Giovanni Bellini, here pictured in the middle. So while Jacopo Bellini was in Florence in the workshop of Gentile da Fabriano in 1423, which is when Gentile da Fabriano painted this amazing Adoration of the Magi down there, Gentile da Fabriano is painting that at a time when Florentine art is really evolving and becoming more naturalistic. And as you can see, that painting down there on the bottom left depicts animals in motion. He is really experimenting with more chiaroscuro to make the figures appear with more volume, to make the image appear more dynamic, and to give a really persuasive sense of space. Now, he hasn't used linear perspective here. It isn't ordered in the way that painters would orientate their space slightly later. If you think of painters like Masaccio and Fra Filippo Lippi, there's a far more ordered sense of perspective, which makes the space itself appear more naturalistic. But Gentile da Fabriano is there at a very, very important time. And it is the time where painting starts to become increasingly naturalistic, especially in Florence. And so that is something that Jacopo Bellini is influenced by, and he passes that on to Giovanni. And it's Giovanni whose paintings we're going to be focusing on in this series. We're also going to look at one of his drawings at the very end as well, so look forward to that. All right, so like many workshops in this time, this is, the Bellini workshop is a real vortex of artistic ideas, as many of the great Renaissance workshops were. And it's just this era, when Giovanni Bellini is training and is coming of age, in that era, art is really transforming very quickly because of all of the figures here displayed. We've now arrived at a page which is full of art, and all of this is feeding in and transforming painting. And it's Giovanni Bellini who is one of the central figures in channeling all of these transformations into a really coherent and resolved, meticulous approach to painting. Okay, and so now we are going to venture in to the workshop and look at one of Giovanni Bellini's paintings here. All right, so this is Giovanni Bellini painting early in his career. This is painted around 1453 when he is in his early 20s. And this really does show a receptivity to all of the influences that I've just mentioned. And what I'm going to talk about now is some of the things that really make Bellini stand out as an artist. What he was most revolutionary at doing. Okay, so what he did most differently and what makes him really stand out in the history of art. He really did revolutionize Venetian painting. He reimagined oil painting for the Venetian School. He actually reimagined the use of the oil paint medium. Now, oil painting as a full system of painting was pioneered in the Netherlands earlier on in the 15th century by the Van Eyck brothers. And Giovanni Bellini is an artist who really absorbed that medium and reinvented its application for the Venetian School. Now, this painting is on tempera, and this is Giovanni Bellini using the medium that was used throughout the Middle Ages into the early Renaissance and used well into the 15th century, especially in Florence. And it's the medium of icons. It's the paint of illuminations. Well, illuminators would use watercolor, they would use body color, they'd also sometimes use tempera, but tempera paint, which is pigment bound in egg yolk, was used in panel painting across Italy and the northern countries throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And what Bellini does is he is the first painter to really transform the application and use of oil paint for the Venetian School. And he uses it in layers of glazes. He revolutionizes the Venetian use of color as well, using bright colors, really warm colors, and using color with real compositional sense, as we're going to see throughout the series. So he's heavily influenced by Northern artists in his use of oil, but also this painting does also show that he is influenced by Northern painters in his sense of proximity to the subject, and also the immediacy and naturalism with which he's depicted the subjects there. That we have a closeness to the subject, which really does borrow from Northern painters. The use of color is something that he was very pioneering with, as I've mentioned. His use of color is very vivid and gets increasingly vivid later on. This is a very early painting, but we're going to see some really vivid use of color. One of the really most unique things about Bellini, which we'll be discovering in this series and later today, is his depiction of his environment and his attention to the detailed naturalism of organic and natural forms, plants and objects and landscapes. Now he's an artist who is really observant. He doesn't, you can't expect an artist like Bellini to paint observationally. His paintings are based on designs, and the designs are rooted in observation, but they make use of invention and fantasia and imagination and memory, which is, these are all things that are bound up within Renaissance design and the configuration of images. So his paintings aren't observational in the modern sense of painting from nature, but his paintings really are really saturated in his world, which he has seen and experienced. And that's something that really does set Bellini apart from artists that came before him. His landscapes and the objects that he paints they seem familiar to him, and they also would have been familiar to his own contemporaries. So, for example, in his landscapes, it's as though you're looking out into the Veneto region of Italy. So he doesn't paint he's an artist. He transforms lots of different genres of painting, including the Madonna and Child. And Madonna and Child is a is a subject in Renaissance art which you see everywhere in painting and in sculpture. He transformed that subject in painting, and one of the ways that he did that was by depicting the Virgin and Child with a Venetian landscape behind them. So he would bring his own world into the painted world in a really subtle and delicate way, which is completely unique. And that's something that we're going to be discovering in this series. So that's something I wanted to add. I mean, this landscape by itself, he's a real pioneer of landscape painting, and his emphasis on the landscape is really novel. In his lifetime, he really introduces a new level of attention to the landscape, a new use of the landscape in various different genres. He's also an artist who blurs the distinction between genres. Now, in the past, at Drawing from History, we have learned that lots of artists blur the boundaries between genres of painting. Caravaggio was a great one, wasn't he? Because he would paint scenes of everyday life, but it would become a genre painting because he was telling a story. But it shouldn't be a genre painting because he's painting something that is of everyday life, but he's giving it the attention and he's painting it in such a way that aesthetically it attains the status of a genre painting. And so he blurs the boundary between different classes of painting. Now, Bellini starts doing that as well much earlier than Caravaggio, which is another reason why he is such an important and inventive artist. With his Virgin and Child paintings, sometimes the landscape is so mesmerizing, it seems to be really, really important as the setting of the scene, which includes the Virgin and Child. Now, obviously, Bellini would never tamper with or try to displace the primacy of the Virgin and Child in a painting in which the Virgin and Child are depicted. But the landscape being such an enhanced aspect of the picture within the context of painting up until Bellini's time is really, really quite pioneering and innovative. And we're definitely going to look at some of those paintings. All right, so this painting, what painting is this? Well, this is a Pieta. It's Christ being supported by the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist after the deposition. You can see the wounds here. We can see the signs of the Passion. We have the holes in Christ's hands from being nailed to the cross. And we can also see the spear wound below his right pectoral, where a soldier pierced him with a spear before he was brought down from the cross. Now we've got the Virgin looking incredibly morose and really grief-stricken, as she always will in a Pieta or in a deposition. And we have St. John the Evangelist to Christ's left there, supporting him by holding his elbow. Now there is a real sculptural sense to this painting, which is highly indebted to Donatello. Okay, so Donatello is the great sculptor of the Renaissance, or one of the great sculptors of the Renaissance. And not only was Mantegna highly receptive to Donatello and to sculpture in general, but so was Bellini, and so were all painters and artists at this time. Okay, so this painting really has a sculptural sense. All of that tonal modeling in the bodies is there to mimic the effects of sculpture, but also in the drapery. It's very, very sculptural. It's got tremendous volume, and the highlights are there to really give a sense of form and volume. It looks almost like a relief sculpture. If you were to see this in monochrome, obviously it's been colored. He's painted it with color in tempera. But if you were to see this painting in black and white, it would look like an imitation of a relief sculpture. And that's something that was deliberate. painters wanted their images to have real form, to have real volume. And that's why there is such an emphasis on the sculptural plasticity of each aspect of the painting. So we've got lots of influence of Donatello there and of sculpture. And we also have to remember that in the time of Bellini and into the 1450s, there was a great influence exerted by the teacher of Mantegna, Francesco Squarcione, who I mentioned quite a lot in the previous series when we were focusing on Mantegna. Now, Squarcione really taught a lot of artists, including Mantegna and Carlo Crivelli, to really focus on sculpture in their drawing and to try to emulate the effects of sculpture and to create a sense of volume in their work. And that had a great influence outside of Padua. And as we know, there was close proximity between Bellini and Mantegna. They were brothers-in-law, and Bellini was heavily influenced by Mantegna, especially at this point early on in his career. So lots of influence from sculptural sources, but also what about icons? Byzantium, as I mentioned in the introduction, was a place where there was lots of exchange with Venice. The Venetians really did have a huge role in not just the trying to stabilize and maintain stability in Byzantium, but also in its downfall. There was a complex dynamic between the Republic of Venice and the Byzantine Empire. Lots of things that are in Venice and were in Venice in the time of Bellini were actually taken from Constantinople. In the year 1204, there was the Fourth Crusade, and the Crusades were intended, they were holy wars, raged against the expansion of the Islamic empires in the East, because Islam came into being in the 7th century, and at a time where Christendom was weakened by the final wars with Persia, and the Islamic empires sort of grew drastically in a very, very short period of time. And so the Christian heartlands of the East, the sort of core territories of Christendom in the East, were conquered by Islamic armies, by Muslims. And the Crusades were supposed to be about reclaiming those territories for Christendom. And they were holy wars that started at the end of the 11th century. And the Fourth Crusade in 1204 didn't go to plan at all for the Byzantines, because instead of being helped by the Venetians and by the Franks, the Latin-speaking Christians from the West, they actually just conquered Constantinople and occupied it up until 1261. So for an entire generation, Constantinople was actually occupied by Latin-speaking Christians from Venice predominantly, and France, the Franks. And they took a lot of cultural and artistic artifacts and gold and sculptures from Constantinople. So the Palladoro and St. Mark's in Venice, that was all in Constantinople and taken to Venice. That helps us understand a bit about the context of this painting now, doesn't it? So this is painted in 1453, and this is 200 years after the Fourth Crusade, and Venice is full of Byzantine things. If this is painted in 1453, then it's painted in the very same year that Constantinople finally succumbs to the Turkish invasion. And Constantinople then collapses and is absorbed within the Islamic world. And that context really helps us understand a little bit about why there's such an Italo-Byzantine aesthetic in this painting. Now, Italian painting from the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance had really started to develop away from the Byzantine iconographic style or manner. But this painting retains quite a lot of it. And I think it's because Bellini was, as I've said, he was a nexus of invention. He was absorbing lots of different influences. You know, his father was trained by Gentile da Fabriano, was exposed to lots of Florentine influence, and he's heavily influenced by Donatello and a whole generation of artists who were influenced by Donatello and Francesco Squarcione, who tried to make their paintings more sculptural. There's a new use of perspective because of Masaccio, because of Leon Battista Alberti and Filippo Brunelleschi in Florence in the opening years of the 1400s. And there's also this Byzantine influence. This painting really does have an iconographic feel to it, a medieval iconographic aesthetic to it, while having the naturalism and sculptural aspect of painting that we'd more associate with Renaissance art. Okay, so lots going on in there in his early career, as you can see. Now we do have this painting as a signature on the parapet in the front, Johann's B, which is the Latinized name of Giovanni. Okay, so Johann's is he's written his name in Latin there, and B for his surname. So this is a really, really amazing independent work. Just seeing that we've got a couple of questions in the chat up there. We've got Jim saying, why not give his skull its due? Which skull was that, Jim? Is that a Hamlet reference you're making there? And then, Jim?
Hi. Yeah, no, it was just in the first self-portrait that you showed. The hat sort of like cuts off the back of his cranium. And I just that part, was that just what they did in those days?
Well, the hat, yeah, it seems to distort something of the sort of roundness of the skull.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think that in this period, not all of the paint, you know, you will notice things like that, oddities and perhaps liberties taken with proportion at this time. I would have to go back to it and really see if it looks like there's been something like that going on. But I think that maybe the cap is really pressing down on his hair, and it maybe looks like part of the skull has been obscured. But yeah, no, I think that in the Renaissance, there are lots of liberties taken. They're not always depicting things exactly as they truly are. And, and so you will see things that might look suspicious to a modern eye, especially if a modern eye is accustomed to a more academic approach to drawing, a more sort of atelier or academic approach to drawing from life. So Renaissance artists didn't draw in that way, and they didn't feel obliged to render every form exactly as it looked at a given moment. Design in the Renaissance is quite a different way of drawing to modern art and to modern drawing. And then Rian has asked about Pieta. Pieta is the subject of the Virgin and saints sometimes accompanying the Virgin while she is cradling the dead Christ. Okay, that's the Pieta. It's the subject in art. All right, so this has been our first painting that we've really looked at by Bellini, and we can see that he is combining lots of different influences here, but the main one is the visual influence of sculpture, I think, and that is really what he is going for while depicting this image. Also, the depth of emotion in this painting is really powerful. Already, you know, Christ looks very deathly. You know, he's dead. He's about to be entombed. Now, St. John the Evangelist is crying. His mouth is open. His eyes are, there's tension in his brow, and his eyes are really compressed. You know, these upper eyelids are really compressed because of the tension in the brow. And the mouth is open, which gives us a sense of noise. Bellini is an artist who doesn't just want you to stimulate your sense of sight. He also wants you to imagine sounds, so that the painting arouses other senses as well. It stimulates other senses. There's lots of touch in the painting. It is very sculptural. It's very tactile. The hands intermingled, and the head resting on the hand like that, which is a typical symbol of melancholy in figurative art. You know, the hand resting on the cheek resting on the hand like that is a symbol of melancholy. It's associated with melancholy. And the face on the Virgin Mary is one of pure grief and sorrow, isn't it? So she's really absorbing his, you know, the fate of Christ. He is the man of sorrows, and the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled here. You know, her child who was born to her, she was a virgin, but she gave birth to Christ. It was an immaculate conception. The archangel Gabriel came to her and told her that was going to happen, that she would bear the child of God, the Lamb of God, and that he would grow and he would be sacrificed. And so she knew, and so he is the man of sorrows, but she is there. Even though she is Queen of Heaven, she is in complete sorrow there. So he's really depicting the emotional states of these three subjects as well in this Pieta. All right, so I think it is time for us to go and look at our next painting. Now we are going to fast forward quite significantly in the next painting. We're going to look at something different. It's a different subject, and we are going to have another chance to really touch upon a lot of the ideas that I summarized at the beginning. Okay, so here we've got an amazing Madonna and Child from the late 1480s, and what a difference in this painting. What an enormous difference and leap from that first painting that we looked at to this painting. We have a completely different sense of emotion. It's far more subtle. The emotional state of the subject isn't as visceral. Okay, it's not a Pieta, it's not, there's not the lament isn't so immediate, although she does know the fate of the child. And in lots of Madonna and Child paintings with the Virgin adoring the Christ child, there will be symbols and allusions to the fate of Christ, to the passion of Christ, and you know, him being crucified when he is a man, when he is an adult. And Mary in these paintings, in Virgin and Child paintings, will often show sadness and sorrow because she knows about what's going to happen to him, to her beloved child. But you can see here, she's actually looking straight out at us. And that is a very, very different way to treat the Madonna and Child in a painting in this time. He is looking at her, he's looking up at her. He looks like he's kind of, his head is about to roll back, you know, and she is supporting her baby's head, as you often do when you're holding a young baby. You have to support the head like that, otherwise the head will sort of, you know, the heads are heavy, aren't they? And a child, you know, a baby is macrocephalic. They have enormous heads, don't they, compared to they're disproportionately large compared to their body. Well, disproportionately if you're comparing them to sort of adult men and women. But with the child there, she's supporting the head up, supporting his head, and he's looking at her, but then she is looking directly at us in a very quiet and subtle, but yet a very intimate and engaging way, without expressing too much emotion. She is engaging with us like a normal person. She isn't surprised that we're here. She is just there looking like a mother holding her child who is engaging with us now. that is a very, very interesting way to treat the Madonna child. Very, very new. Okay, so very pioneering in that regard. This is also I've made a mistake here. That should write oil on wood there. That is actually oil on wood. That shouldn't say tempera, it should say oil. Okay, so this is actually oil on panel as opposed to tempera on panel. Okay, so that is a really, really important distinction to make from that previous painting. I'm just going to change that actually because I can't bear it. Wait a moment, pause this. So as I was saying, it is oil on panel, not tempera on panel. And as you can see, the paint has a completely different effect. Now in this painting, Bellini is still really emphasizing the sculptural sense of the figures and the drapery. He's also introduced some different aspects now, hasn't he? He's introduced a veil behind, a curtain behind, and he's introduced a sky, and he's introduced a beautiful landscape. We still have that parapet in front, which really separates our space from the divine space of the Virgin. She is, after all, as I already mentioned, the Queen of Heaven, the Mother of God, and therefore divine. And so her space, her environment is separated from ours, but she's still, but it's still very sculptural, but she's also really looking out at us and engaging with us. And she is occupying a landscape which would have been very familiar to somebody around at the time of Bellini. Okay, so that is something that Bellini starts doing, which really distinguishes him from other painters from his time and before his time. This landscape, it would be like looking out at the Veneto region to a contemporary. That's something that really heavily influenced Giorgione and influenced Titian and influenced Parma Vecchio and influenced Sebastiano del Piombo, these artists who were taught by Bellini later on in the early 16th century and late 15th century. So the use of architecture there at the front again with the parapet, which again has Bellini's name in Latin. So we've got that sculptural element in the parapet, but also in the sculptural form of the Madonna and the Child. And that sort of use of the architecture there at the front of the parapet, that's something that would really persist in Venetian painting. So if you look at a Sebastiano del Piombo portrait or a Titian portrait, that there is very often a parapet. And the parapet at the floor of the canvas or panel distinguishes between the space of us, our space as viewers, and the space of the subject, whether it's a virgin and child or a portrait of a secular person. But Giovanni Bellini, while he uses this, and this tradition of the parapet at the front pertains in the Venetian school, artists like Titian would actually develop on it and do unique things with it and play with it. Bellini would also put objects on it to make us feel like we could potentially sort of engage with the space a bit more. But Titian would have his sitters sort of lean their elbow on it and even lean over it. So it really feels like there is less of a separation between our space and the space of the subject. But in this painting, it is like a border. It's like a metaphysical border between us and the Virgin and Child here. Okay, so that's really interesting, and I wanted to sort of discuss that a little bit about the parapet being a sort of barrier between us and her. She's holding the Christ and adoring him, but she's looking out at us as opposed to him. Now that curtain being pulled across is really unusual. Really, this is really innovative. This is a real innovation that Bellini has got a partially drawn curtain revealing a landscape behind. Now, all painters after Bellini would be influenced by this. Think back to last week when we concluded our series on Mantegna. There wasn't anything quite as subtly peculiar about Mantegna's paintings. Mantegna did some remarkable things, like having his painted figures really lean out of the painted world into the physical world, and having objects appear as though they could be picked up from the canvas, and having us look up at the ceiling and look out at the sky through the ceiling, but it's an illusion. So there are things that Mantegna did that are utterly transformative and utterly pioneering. But this is a more subtle innovation with Bellini here. And we saw last week, when we concluded our series on Mantegna, a backdrop with a Sacra Conversazione, that beautiful tempera on canvas painting of the Virgin and Child accompanied by saints. And there was a curtain hanging down behind the Virgin and Child. In this painting, again, there is a curtain hanging down behind the Virgin and Child, but someone has come and drawn it slightly, or maybe it was her moments before this brief moment in time. Now, what does this mean, though? It's very, very interesting that Bellini has actually introduced something very temporal into a painting of a divine subject. And by temporal, I mean a partially drawn curtain. It's suggestive of someone a moment or so ago having pulled that curtain a little bit to reveal some of the landscape behind. And there is a mythological reference I would like to briefly mention, and that is one of Hypnos. Hypnos is the personification or the god of sleep in ancient Greek mythology. And in this time in Venice, there was lots of exchange between the Greeks who were leaving formerly Byzantine territories and entering into Italy as refugees and as migres. And that meant that there was this huge sort of explosion in the availability of Greek texts and also understanding of Greek texts, because you had far more Greek speakers and literate Greek people who were enabling the dissemination of more Greek literature. And I'm not going to try and claim that Giovanni Bellini is making a direct reference to Hypnos here. However, there is a rather pleasing symmetry between this painting and the legend of Hypnos. Hypnos is the god who draws the veil of night across the sky and then lifts it back to reveal day. And in Christ's life, he is born in he is conceived immaculately in the womb of Mary by the grace of God, according to Christian scripture. And he lives a normal human life. Well, normal being, he lives a life, but a fully human life, but also a fully divine life. So he has this sort of dual nature, doesn't he? And he lives a very radical life, and he then faces his crucifixion. And it's that cycle of the life of Christ, which is a recurring theme in Christian painting. It's cyclical. It's the life cycle of Christ, and then after his death, he is then risen and then ascends to heaven, and then will come again one day. Now, that sort of storytelling of Christ, where he dies and then he is reborn or resurrected, and then he ascends back to heaven, and then is back in the sort of eternal realm of heaven. That sort of cycle is emulated to a degree by that curtain being drawn across to reveal day. It's like the passing of time and the cycle of the day. And I think that curtain being drawn across has a kind of symmetry with the legend of Hypnos, the mythology around Hypnos, because that curtain being drawn, it reveals the day there, that landscape there. And I think that it's something about storytelling. It's something about telling the life of Christ and telling that cyclical story of birth, death, and rebirth, and although it doesn't go around in a circle and repeat itself, there is something organic about it, like the day and night in their daily cycle. So I think that hypnos is the one that draws that veil. There is a nice connection to be observed in this painting, whether or not it's deliberate or done mindfully by Bellini. Now, that landscape is painted with real delicacy and real care. He has not painted it as a fantastical landscape. He's not painted it as a landscape that could be anywhere other than Venice. He's an artist who does that all the time. In his paintings, where there is a landscape, it's a landscape that he would have known. He didn't paint landscapes of anywhere else to suit his particular topic. He always painted the landscapes to reflect his own region. And I think that that's because he wanted to paint, he wanted to paint his own world, that he wanted to, as a painter, he didn't want to paint things that weren't truthful to him, or he wanted his paintings to be based on his own experience, his own actual life. He's not necessarily painting from observation. Renaissance painters didn't do that. They painted from designs, as I've mentioned earlier, and designs were to an extent based on observation, but they were also based on very rigorous training and learning how to invent forms and to invent compositions and designs. So, but he's still a painter who wants what he depicts to be rooted in something that he could actually experience, so that the paintings had that layer of reality to them. And that's something that makes Bellini a very interesting figure, but also a figure who influences lots of other painters subsequently with his innovations. Now, other painters like Titian and Giorgione, who come after Bellini, who were active during the life of Bellini. Bellini dies in 1516, and well, he dies after Giorgione, actually, because Giorgione dies in 1510. But Giorgione, who's trained by Bellini, and Titian, who's trained by Bellini, would carry on doing that. You have Noli Me Tangere by Titian, and there's a beautiful Veneto landscape being depicted, and the little town in Noli Me Tangere, which means don't touch me in Latin, where Christ is sort of lifting his veil away from Mary Magdalene to say, don't touch me. In the background, Titian has depicted a little Venetian landscape, very much like this one, little townscape as well, very much like that, very recognizably derived from sort of Bellini's style, Bellini's manner of doing it. And then if you would look at Giorgione's sunset, it's almost like looking at the same landscape as in Titian's Noli Me Tangere, painted around the same time. So you can really see how this habit of Bellini, or this preoccupation with painting what is real to him and the environment that he knows in his paintings, it affects painters later on who he teaches, who might not share his reasons for doing that, but they do it nonetheless. They're impacted by it nonetheless because it is so effective. It's about the effect on the audience, isn't it? You can't say an artist themselves, an artist, his or herself, they can't say my painting is really good and effective. It's not for them to decide. They can't really decide that. It's for the people who see it to decide that. If it resonates with people, it's because there's something in that painting that excites something in the mind. It excites the imagination. It stimulates the imagination because it resonates with something that is already in there. And with Giorgione and Titian continuing to paint the landscape to paint a familiar landscape into their paintings after Bellini introduces doing that, it shows that it had an effect. It's something that they continue to do, not because of the same reasons that Bellini had, but because they chose to. It had an impact. It was pleasing to do, and it was pleasing for their contemporaries, and that's why things in art persist. They don't persist if they don't resonate with people. They're not successful if they don't resonate with people. And so that tells us that seeing their own familiar landscape in these paintings meant something to the people of this time. That might give you ideas for work that you want to do in your art. You know, you might be looking to do some paintings, and you need to find a way that of doing it that draws from your own interests and develops on your own ideas and your own feelings, while having elements that really resonate with other people, because it can't just be it can't be you that decides. It's only the rest of us. So the landscape thing worked, didn't it? Because it endured, and things don't endure in art if they don't really work, if they don't have an effect and stimulate people's interest. So Giovanni Bellini started painting his own landscapes into these paintings, and his followers followed suit, and it really did endure. And it was because he chose to. No one had really done that beforehand, even Mantegna. So really fascinating. I'm very happy to be doing Bellini at last. We've looked at a couple of Bellinis in the past, drawing from history. A couple of years ago, we did one on the nude in Renaissance art, and we looked at Giorgioni's Sleeping Venus, which is gobsmackingly, ridiculously amazing. And then we looked at Bellini, this nude lady holding a mirror with the landscape in the background, which we'll probably look at in part 3 of this series. And we looked at Titian with his various different nudes. I mean, lots of, you know, but Giorgioni is someone who really transforms a nude in Renaissance painting. How did we get onto nudes? Yeah, talking about when we looked at Giovanni Bellini before, that's right. It was when we were looking at the nude in Renaissance painting, in Renaissance art. But we've never done just a proper workshop on Bellini, so I'm really, really happy and excited to be doing it finally. I don't know why I haven't done one sooner. Okay, so what else have we got? We've got quite intense chiaroscuro here, haven't we, in this painting? It's, you know, really, you know, the modeling is extraordinary, and the oil paint has been really used to render and model the drapes and the form of Christ's body and the face of the Virgin. He's a much better painter than he was in the previous painting, isn't he? That Pieta painting looks almost crude next to this painting, which is painted a decade or so later, a couple of decades later. And, you know, the use of oil is very significant. Okay, so you prepare a panel in the same way. You do an underpainting with tempera or distemper paint, and then you would paint the most of the image in oils. You build up layer upon layer of oils. Not that many layers. There is this myth that old master paintings, that Renaissance paintings were painted in dozens of layers. It's not true. You can't really do that. Because the paint layers will become increasingly unstable, because they would have to have more oil in. They'd have to be more rich in oil in every subsequent layer, which would actually cause more cracking and more shrinkage and greater discoloration if you painted in so many layers. One day I'll do a oil painting and a Renaissance oil painting course, which you'll all obviously sign up for. I will do one of those one day. But you can see that the paint has been really used to really sculpt that form. With oil, it stays wet much longer than tempera. Tempera dries really quickly. And so when you're painting in tempera, you're almost hatching really with the paint. And that's why silver point drawing was so essential for training in the 15th century. But when oils came into being, silver point became, it was eclipsed by more porous drawing materials like chalk, basically red and black chalk like this and red chalk like this. You know, if you know anyone who owns land in Tuscany, in in the sort of Monte Amiata region, then you must, and you must ask them if they can dig up any of this for me. Okay, if they live near the Albania River in Tuscany, let me know, because I'd want to pay them a visit and dig up their garden, see if I can find any of this red bowl sanguine chalk. This is from Germany, actually, this red chalk. And this is from Piedmont, this black chalk. It's of extraordinarily high quality. That's what they started to, that was available much earlier, but artists didn't really draw with it that much because they didn't really figure out the best way to use it. That came about after Botticelli and Leonardo and Verrocchio, and then subsequently Michelangelo started to really pioneer a new approach of drawing with red and black chalk. But silver point was so important for artists when the dominant medium of painting was tempera, because tempera, you can't do all of this sort of glazing and remodeling with tempera because it dries so quickly, but with oil, it stays wet so that you can manipulate it on the surface. Because, I mean, Bellini's painting with walnut oil, which dries pretty slow. It dries even slower than linseed oil. You know, after a couple of days, it's linseed oil is still quite tacky when you've applied it in a very thin layer. Walnut oil will stay malleable for slightly longer. It doesn't polymerize as quickly as linseed oil. But with oil paint, you can actually work the paint and thin it out after applying it with a brush or with a cloth. Now, when you're working with pigments like that, that is a lot of lapis lazuli, and that is incredibly high grade of lapis lazuli. That pigment is a lot of money that has gone into this painting, because whoever commissioned this painting would have had to have paid Bellini a lot for the materials. There's vermilion for the backdrop, and there's cochineal or rose madder, which has been used to glaze on top of the vermilion. And then there is ultramarine, ultramare, which means the pigment from across the sea. Ultramare means over the sea, from over the sea. And lapis lazuli is that pigment from over the sea. That is what ultramarine is, or was, before the 19th century, before the French discovered how to chemically create a synthetic alternative to lapis lazuli. That was the blue pigment, the main blue pigment. You have others like azurite, which is a far cheaper pigment, far more affordable mineral-based pigment. But lapis lazuli is the blue, the beautiful blue, very violet kind of blue, very deep. When you have a fine grade of it, it does come in different grades, but the finest grades are incredibly deep and dark. And there is a lot of it on that painting. To get it as dark as that, it's unmixed as well. You would only mix it with bits of lead white and lesser grades of ultramarine, and you would paint with the ultramarine on top of layers in azurite. So you build up a base of blue and white, and then paint with the very, very expensive grades on top in a couple of layers. And this is extraordinary how much is on that painting. And it speaks to the status of Bellini as well. A painter of lesser status wouldn't really be executing paintings like this with this kind of material, because a patron wouldn't entrust a lesser painter with materials of such expense that would cost so much for the person commissioning the painting. There's also lapis lazuli in the sky, and no doubt some azurite and some lesser grade lapis lazuli. You get different grades of lapis lazuli. The lesser grades contain more ash, and what you do when you pulverize a rock of lapis lazuli, and then you would filter it into different grades, and it's a very painstaking and long process, which just adds to the expense of the pigment. Not only does it travel great distances, which adds to its price, but it is also very costly and time consuming to process, and so that adds to the price as well. So pigments are incredibly important when we're considering what artists are really doing. The pigments are really important because the paint is really pigment. All paint is a pigment. That's some indigo pigment in there. Okay, natural indigo. You wouldn't really use that in oil though. and linseed oil. And this is organic, cold pressed flaxseed oil. Okay, linseed oil. Okay, that's all you need to make oil paint. You have to disperse pigment particles in oil by grinding it on a glass slab. I've got one behind me. You can probably see it there, that drying on the radiator there. So they would have used porphyry and a porphyry muller to sort of crush and grind pigments on. And the paint is like such an important thing to consider when we're talking about and learning about these works of art. So if we look at the previous painting just briefly, that is tempera and that is oil. You can see a difference in the material, in the medium, can't you? You should be able to tell now. And when you go to the National Gallery or the Met or wherever you go, you should be able to tell whether it's tempera or oil based on the quality of the paint. Sometimes you can't tell, sometimes it's too difficult. Tempera is amazing though. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the underlayers of this painting were painted in tempera. Why, you might ask? Because it dries very quickly. Also, tempera is really good at sealing gesso. And tempera is really good to paint in oils on top of. So if you have a tempera underpainting, it is beautiful to paint in oils on top of tempera, because the tempera provides a beautiful, slightly absorbent sort of surface for the oils to go on top. So, I mean, it's really fascinating that when you look at the history of painting, it's not always what it just says on the museum wall. And it's not always what it simply says in the book as well, unless you're looking at a technical bulletin or a technical analysis. And the technical analysis will often reveal that there's far more on the panel or canvas than it might be assumed by a curator and or by a viewer, for that matter. And if you look at Rembrandt, for example, one of the reasons why he was able to use so much Castle earth, which is also called Van Dyke brown pigment, and paint over it, it's because he wasn't mixing it with oil, he was mixing it with hide glue and turning it into distemper paint as opposed to oil paint, and then working up a whole canvas using two different types of paint. But in the gallery, it would just say oil on canvas when it's actually distemper and oil on canvas. So yeah, painters are clever and they have to overcome lots of different challenges when they are trying to meet the expectations of their clientele and also their milieu more widely. So lots of yeah, fantastic. This painting not only influenced by Mantegna and Jacopo Bellini by this point, he's influenced by far more, and he's also really experimenting with his own ideas at this point. It's not merely illusionistic as well in its sculptural capacity, this painting. There's also a real metaphorical and poetic subtlety to it with that curtain. And the gaze is very, very, very subtle and immediate and intimate and sensuous, but in a very delicate and tasteful way. He's showing a great deal of genius now already at this point, I think. Also, I mean, I must mention in this painting as well, Antonello da Messina. I've mentioned him already. Antonello da Messina was a great painter from Messina in Sicily, and he traveled north and brought a lot of oil painting techniques to Italy. And Bellini is very aware of Antonello da Messina, and Messina was a great artist. Antonello da Messina was a great artist at capturing expressions, and really subtle expressions and ambiguous expressions, and sometimes quite visceral expressions, but also, they're always expressions that really engage the viewer, and that's what Bellini is doing here. So he's also showing an awareness of Antonello da Messina, who we must do a workshop on at some point in the future. I love his work. There's a beautiful painting by him in Cefalù of a grinning man, Cefalù in Sicily, which is amazing, and if you ever get a chance to visit, you must go to the little museum in Cefalù. It's a beautiful little town in Sicily, which I love, and there's an amazing Antonello da Messina painting there. So, yeah, Sicily is amazing. If you ever get a chance to visit Palermo and the rest of Sicily, you must go. Yeah, beautiful. All right, so I mean, this development of the gaze like this and the facial expression, combining that with a landscape and a sort of dynamic scene where the curtain's being drawn, this is all vital to the understanding of how Venetian painting would develop. Okay, so this is really showing us what Bellini is so important for. All right, we ought to move on now, I think, because we've looked at this for ages and I've been going on about it forever. So let's look at that now. All right, so now we've got Bellini's Agony in the Garden. Now, do you remember when we did our first week on Mantegna? We had an Agony in the Garden there, didn't we? And we're back to tempera. This is an earlier painting. So it's so fascinating, isn't it, that Bellini, an artist of this time, born in the 1430s, you know, slightly older than Verrocchio. Verrocchio was born in 1435 in Florence. So he's of the same generation as Verrocchio. It's 5 years older or so. And these artists of that generation, you have these great workshops that were so pioneering, so innovative. They fluctuate between media at this time because oil paint is starting to come in Italy. It's starting to become more popular in Italy. Bellini is one of the main instigators of the rise of oil painting in Italy in this period. And this is him back in tempera. So he really learned how to paint with tempera, didn't he? That's how he started. But then he transitions to oil, or starts to make greater use of oil later on, subsequently. So here we have his Agony in the Garden, painted sometime between 1458 and 1460. And you will remember that it was Mantegna's Agony in the Garden. Let's just look at them side by side quickly. Mantegna's Agony in the Garden, that was painted slightly earlier, a few years earlier, from 1455 to 56, whereas Bellini's one is in 1458 to 1460. Both of them are tempera on panel, and as you can see in the measurements there, the Bellini is significantly longer and a little bit taller. Okay, so Bellini's panel is larger. It's both taller and longer than Mantegna's Agony in the Garden. And there are two very different scenes. He's depicted the scene. He's really borrowed extensively from Mantegna, but it's also a very, 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 very different scene. Let's go back. Okay, so here, look, we've got Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's in agony, emotional agony, and he's also in a state of absolute terror because he knows that he's going to be crucified. Don't forget that in the Christian story of Christ's life and Christ's death, well, it's not necessarily in the story. The Bible isn't actually 100% clear on this, is the nature of Christ himself. It says that he's the Son of God and that he is the path to heaven, but it doesn't actually say that he is fully God and fully man at the same time. That came about later on in the 5th century, the Christian doctrine that Christ is both fully man and fully God, that he actually is God in human form and is at the same time 100% man and 100% God. That came about in the 5th century in Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea in 325, in the 4th century, in the 4th century, the year 325 at the Council of Nicaea. It's where they actually determined ecumenically that Christ was fully God and fully human. And so he is there, even though he is fully God and fully human, according to the Nicene Creed, he is in agony in a very human way. He's having a very human experience. And that does actually kind of raise a bit of questions for the Nicene Creed, I think, actually, because he is fully human, but it's human all too human, isn't it? For him to be pleading with God to spare him this fate. He's actually pleading for his cup to be swapped for another. And that's the agony in the garden. when he knows that Judas is carrying his silver, which he has taken from the Roman soldiers for having betrayed Christ. And there they are, leading their way up towards the garden. Christ knows what's going to happen, and he's there in agony, and his apostles, John and Peter and James, are asleep. And he's there sort of praying, and it's as though he's taking mass. And let me show you why it's as though he is actually taking mass. The vision of an angel there is not depicted as a real vision. Okay, if we just quickly look at the both side by side again, look at Mantegna's one. Mantegna's one has got these 5 putti there bearing the objects of Christ's passion: the cross, the pillar which he is tied to and flagellated on, and they are painted naturalistically, just as naturalistically as the rest of the image. Whereas in Bellini's one, it's just one angel, and it's depicted as a vision coming out of the clouds. It's almost like a glassy, transparent, ghost-like vision. Very different from the Mantegna. So he is really drawing from Mantegna. He's literally drawing from history, but he's drawing from his own contemporary history, isn't he? So he's really learning from Mantegna, but he's doing things very, very differently. He's giving much more space to the figures, and he's created this huge sort of landscape. He's turned it far more into a landscape painting than Mantegna did. And the landscape feels more real. The sky feels more real, more naturalistic. The landscape feels more believable and familiar, whereas Mantegna's one is more phantasmagorical, more based on pure invention. Now we can see there are some symbols of the Passion, though, but they're far more subtle. Whereas Mantegna just gave you the objects. He just gives you the objects. Here are the objects of Christ's Passion, so that you can see them immediately. There is a far greater extent of poetic and philosophical handling of these symbols in this painting. The spiky, spiny, thorny wood of the fence is reminiscent of the crown of thorns, which is in turn reminiscent of the blood that would come from Christ's body. And then we also have the blood that would come from Christ's body in the goblet held by the angel in the clouds. And that is what really makes it look as though Christ is taking mass here. It's giving the Christian viewer of this painting a sense of Christ at mass, which is something that a Christian would do in Renaissance Italy during mass. They would kneel at the altar like that. Bellini has painted a rock which is very much like an altar, and the angel is bringing down and bearing a cup, and the cup is carrying the blood of the Eucharist, which is how you take mass as a Catholic. So he's situating Christ in a position which would be familiar to worshippers in Bellini's own time, in a landscape which may well have been familiar, with canals and water and everything. So it's and bridges. There's also noise, snoring, but Christ is facing away from us, looking out to the distance, looking up to the sky. We've got a procession of Judas before he enters the garden. This is after the Last Supper, obviously, when Christ reveals that one of them is going to betray him. It's after Judas's betrayal. He's betraying him as we speak, and then it's before the taking of Christ. There's another great subject which has been depicted by great artists from Giotto up to Caravaggio, is the taking of Christ, but Judas is actually marking Christ with a kiss. just before he is seized and taken to be imprisoned and humiliated, flagellated, and subsequently crucified at the hands of the Romans. So here in the Garden of Gethsemane, taking Mass, heavily influenced by Mantegna. This painting is earlier than the previous one that we looked at, the Virgin and Child. And he's given a far wider space than Mantegna did. So there we are with the Mantegna and the Bellini, and I've made it slightly longer in there to reflect the difference in size and of the two. And now I want us to focus on this beautiful detail. Okay, so I've been talking about the landscape, the beautiful different sort of urban settings there. We've got a hilltop, Veneto hilltop town. We've got these hills. We've got a distant town or village there, and there we have these soldiers, and Judas carrying his bag of silver, his pouch of silver, which he's taken for having betrayed his teacher, his leader. And there's Christ in absolute turmoil, because he knows what's going to befall him. So going back to what makes Bellini so important and so pioneering and so innovative, he's really included so much naturalism and the experienced reality of people at the time. The action of kneeling at the altar, but also the landscape. It's an environment and an action that would have been familiar to his own people at the time. The spreading out of the landscape is completely unique, giving so much space to each of the figures and spreading out the image itself to encompass far more space and to depict more landscape than Mantegna would have seen as appropriate, is really deliberate. He wants there to be more space, more of an environment, a greater sense of compositional subtlety by opening up that space more and giving more room for each of the figures in the picture. Now, Northern artists have been quite influential in the use of and the inclusion of landscape in painting, but also interiors. And in this painting, not only has Mantegna, exploded that landscape, but he's also introduced elements of architecture into it by morphing that rock into something like an altar for Christ to kneel at. Okay, so we're going to look at a drawing by Bellini pretty soon. I hope I haven't crossed the names over too many times. If you've heard me say Mantegna when I should have said Bellini, will have to forgive me, but that will happen from time to time. Just like when I did the Van Dyck workshop some months ago and then went on to Rubens, I sometimes Van Dyck slipped in when I should have said Rubens. But that's the nature of the game, I'm afraid. So yeah, amazing. I love this. And the tempera is painted with such precision, such delicacy. And it's amazing work for a medium that dries so quickly. You have to work quite quickly with tempera. You have to have things planned out quite a lot. In oil paint, when painters started to work in oils, you find compositions evolving and changing and morphing as the artist's ideas develop and as they experiment more. Oil paint opens up a completely different artistic approach to painting because of its virtues of slow drying and layerability. You can actually apply opaque layers which obscure preliminary layers so that you can experiment again with a different set of ideas, a different dynamic and a different composition. So oil painting really did transform art, and it led towards a more modern approach to painting. Actually, tempera is amazing, and it's really good to learn how to paint with tempera. It dries, you know, it has lots of virtues. It's a fantastic paint, and some pigments work better in tempera than they do in oil, such as lesser grades of lapis lazuli. They won't, you know, a pigment which is high in alkaline will be more suitable to an egg tempera than it would be to an oil, because the alkali and the fat will saponify and lose adhesion to the surface. So tempera does have some advantages. Its drying time is a great advantage. It's a great advantage for artists if they're learning to paint, and it's very easy to make. Tempera is actually very easy to make, and it's a lot cleaner, and it's really suitable for small scale works. I mean, we're going to be doing some tempera pretty soon with my year 3s when we start in September. We're also going to be doing some distemper, which dries really quick as well. And I've got some jars for you. I'm going to be sending you some pigments which I've made here in Tottenham. No toxic ones yet. You have to wait. You have to see. You have to make sure you're mature enough before I send you some toxic pigments, if I ever do, which I might, if I can make that possible. And but yes, it's absolutely brilliant. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a drawing. Okay, so we don't have much time left. So there we go. Look at that. That is an astonishing, beautiful early drawing by Giovanni Bellini. There, I nearly did say Mantegna again. So beautiful drawing by Bellini. It's the head of an old bearded man from around 1460 or 1470, in that sort of time frame. Now, the tonal quality of this drawing is something that really stands out, and that is really during the Renaissance, especially after the, well, now throughout the 15th century, right from the beginning of the 15th century, artists would draw on tone paper. And when they were drawing from sculptures, when they were drawing from reliefs, and when they were drawing from live models in the workshop, they would often draw on tone paper, especially after they had some experience. It wasn't something that you would always start doing as an apprentice, but as an apprentice in the Renaissance, you would eventually, after a year or so of learning the basic principles of drawing, you would start to use a more dynamic application of tone. And you would start to draw by dynamic application of tone. I mean, not only drawing shadows, but actually also drawing light. And in Cennino Cennini's Craftsman Handbook, he writes about tinting your papers, either, you know, saying that a green tint or a blue tint green tint is the most popular according to Cennino Cennini. We don't really see that in the extant evidence, but Cennino Cennini was around in the late 1300s and very early 1400s. So not necessarily reflective of Bellini's time or Leonardo's time. Leonardo really liked blue paper, but he also liked white paper and just off-white paper. Leonardo did. We see quite nice red paper used by Leonardo as well. And with Leonardo, the paper is almost always tinted with distemper, pigments ground into water like this. So this is the pigment used for preparing paper in the Renaissance. That is bone ash pigment in a paste. So Cennino Cennini writes about doing exactly this, grinding pigments into a paste, dispersing all of the particles into water, and then taking some of that pigment out and mixing it with some hide glue. He recommends using glue from the skin of goats, and then brushing that in a few layers onto paper. And so, yeah, there you go. That's the bone ash paste, and this is the pigment. And this is all made here at the Renaissance workshop. Okay, that is the bone white pigment used to prepare paper during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And once you'd tint your paper, you'd add some indigo, or you'd add some vermilion, or some lead red, or you'd add some earth pigments, or a mixture of them. They often used quite complex mixtures of pigments, not always complex, but there's often 2 or 3 different pigments in the paper preparation. And the toned ground would enable the artist not just to draw with line and to produce shadows with hatching, but they would also be able to draw the lights onto a toned ground. And there's quite, Cellino gives some pretty good instructions of how to actually do this technically, how to approach that. But yeah, so we've got this fabulous drawing, which is in the Royal Collection. And as you can see, and it's a fairly large drawing, it's 26 centimeters, which is quite big, and 19 centimeters across. So it's quite a large drawing. And we think that it may be referencing to some extent, this St. Anthony Abbot, which was painted by possibly all three Bellinis. Similar subject there, but it's far more naturalistic in Bellini's drawing. It's a very similar subject, and probably is referencing it. He may have changed things while drawing it, or they may have drawn the same person. It may be from, I doubt very much it's actually drawn directly from life. It may have been drawn from drawings that made reference to a certain person, and Bellini adapted the drawing. The process and approach to drawing is really fascinating in the Renaissance, and really is inventive, and inventive in the sense that it's not entirely reliant on observation. So yeah, we've got this image there, which is from a triptych, which is now in the Accademia in Venice. It's the Saint Sebastian triptych by Jacopo Bellini, but it's quite possible that not only Jacopo Bellini worked on that triptych, but so did the young Giovanni and Gentile Bellini as well. Okay, so that's a real direct connection to this drawing, which could even show us the source of inspiration for the drawing. Okay, so there's that. And yeah, so there's brush and ink with white body color. Okay, what body color is basically pigment bound in gum arabic, and that sounds a lot like watercolor, doesn't it? Except body color is more highly pigmented than watercolor. It's a thick watercolor. That's what body color is. Sometimes you would add something to bulk it as well, like chalk or even bone ash to grind the lead white into water. You would combine that pigment and water with gum arabic to make a watercolor, and then you might add more ground chalk or bone white to give more body to it, or you might simply add more lead white pigment to make it more pigment rich, more pigment heavy, so that it's more opaque, and then it is applied with a brush as though it is tempera. So what this drawing shows us is a very traditional approach of a Renaissance artist learning to draw and practicing drawing in a way that would prepare them for painting with chiaroscuro while modeling the lights as well as the darks. Now, the paper was once blue, and there are blue pigments that fade. Indigo is one of them. And so it's azurite. Azurite will fade. Azurite is quite an expensive pigment. It's not as expensive as lapis lazuli, but it is an expensive pigment and would probably not be used as frequently as indigo for paper preparation for drawing. But while this drawing may reference that earlier painting by Bellini, by Jacopo Bellini, and possibly his two sons, Gentile and Giovanni, it may also simply be an independent work in its own right, this drawing. Okay, so lots of possibilities for this drawing. It's not conclusively interpreted. So we've got a really interesting mix of different media. He would have started it in a dry media. Wouldn't have started the drawing in ink. He would have started it in charcoal or black chalk, or possibly even metal point. The drawing has a fabulous tonality to it. There are lots of different values of tone, lots of different tonal qualities. The darkest areas are in the hood, around and some of the contours, and on the right side of the image, so on the left of the sitter and underneath the cloak. there are these beautiful dark areas which give a sense of recess and give a sense of depth. And some of the contours are accented very selectively. Some of the contours are really negated in the lightest parts, like on the outline of the hood. It's a highlight as opposed to an outline. And so that contour is actually, the actual outline is negated. It is just, the white is just the edge of the form. There isn't actually a drawn contour visible. He's gone over it with lead white body color. And the white highlights are applied with a very fine brush, and they are applied with the technique of working in tempera. And this is a process that we have, you know, some of the earliest examples we have are from Fra Filippo Lippi. Fra Filippo you know, we are so fortunate that a small but precious selection of Fra Filippo drawings survive, because it really gives us an understanding or a sense of what Florentine and Renaissance drawings in general really look like at this pivotal and transitional time, where artists were training to draw and exercising their drawing in a way which was conducive to them gaining experience with painting. And this drawing really does show that as well. Much later than a Fra Filippo Lippi, but at this time, tempera was still a dominant sort of painting medium in Italy, and artists all around Italy were primarily using tempera as opposed to oils. Oils was used more widely in Italy after this, although artists did quite often use oils as a final layer to the painting, even before the Van Eyck brothers started to use oils as a more complete approach. Okay, so we've covered so much today, and it's been really incredibly fun. And I've gone on far longer than I was supposed to. We're supposed to be looking at each other's drawings now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this up on YouTube as usual. And if you want to revisit it, if you want to look at this workshop again, then you are very welcome to enjoy it as much as you like on YouTube for the rest of your life. And I really hope you do enjoy it, and I really hope you did enjoy tonight. And I really look forward to seeing some of your drawings, everybody. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. I really hope you enjoyed today, and I can't wait to spend some more time with you very soon. And yeah, enjoy the workshop again when I post it on YouTube, and I look forward to seeing you next week